Thank you. Welcome to delegates that are joining us this afternoon. We appreciate your time on a very important matter. Wits Business School would like to thank you for attending. We would like to welcome our guest speakers, Cedric De Beer and Mr. Tendani Nolwando, and our facilitator, Ms. Sindiswa Talani. Thank you for joining us. Today, we are going to be addressing a point or a matter of concern that I think touches each one of us in South Africa. And we will be talking about employee ownership. Employee ownership, as you well know, is quite topical and by many has been seen as a potential in enabling individuals that are trying to make a contribution to the South African economy. I'm now going to hand you over to Ms. Sindiswa, and she will be facilitating this afternoon session. Thank you once again for joining us, and Wits Business School welcomes you. Thank you. Ms. Sindiswa.
Thank you, Janika. Welcome, everyone. And thank you again for this opportunity. My name is Sindiswa Talani, as she has alluded to that. I am from the association, the Southern African Employee Ownership Association. And on my left, it's Cedric. On my right, it's Tendani. She has already introduced us. I'll just take us through what we're going to do in terms of the program, and we'll get the speakers to speak. Firstly, the house rules. All the participants' mics are muted specifically so that we can be able to control on our side who's saying what at what time. We encourage participants to actually write down the questions on the chat box below, and we'll moderate the questions accordingly when we get to the question and answer session. And furthermore, we'll have Tendani talking about the association, telling us about the association. After that, we'll have Dr. Janika, who will take us through a brief uptake of employee ownership in South Africa. And then our main guest speaker, which is Cedric De Beer, who will talk about employee ownership at a larger scale. And from there, we'll take questions and we'll answer questions. We'll probably take more than 10 questions, but it will depend on how the conversation is flowing. Right now, I would like to hand over to Tendani, who will then talk about the association. Tendani.
Thank you. Afternoon, everyone, as attendees to the webinar. We really appreciate the platform that we've been given by Wits Business School to come and make a presentation about the association and the plans that association has. I will request that our technical person share with us, Jayton, you can share with us the presentation. And I think maybe we'll make sure that the presentation will be distributed to the people who are attending this webinar of today. Then, as I was introduced, my name is Tendani Newamondo. I'm a founding director, one of the founding director of the Southern Africa Employee Ownership Association. Then you can go to the next slide. Then the presentation that I'm going to make is going to cover who is Southern Africa Employee Ownership Association. I will share a little bit about the vision of the association, as well as the focus area of the association. Then I will talk about the legislative framework that we have in the country, political buy-in, government buy-in, as well as employee ownership challenges in South Africa. And then thereafter, then I'll share the critical points in terms of the association plans and potential partners or partners that we already work with locally and internationally. And then I will indicate a little bit about the benefits in terms of partnering with the association. And thereafter it will be conclusion. We can go to the other slide. Then Southern Africa Employee Ownership Association is a legal established and registered as a not-for-profit company. It has been registered in terms of Companies Act of 2008 as amended. Then the association was founded by 3 initial directors having diverse qualifications, skills, expertise, experience in the following areas: broad-based Black economic empowerment, economics, as well as employee ownership. For more information about the board of directors or team or the other directors then and advisory council members, you can visit our website, which is www.saeoa.org. The main objective to establish the association is to facilitate a defined South African-based EO program that shall lead to maybe development of EO policy, funding model, tax efficient model, coordinate, guide on the development of implementation plan for EO, coordinate EO database so that we can track to say, how are we doing on implementing employee ownership in the country?
Apologies about that. Just had a technical glitch. Thank you.
Thank you. We apologize, you know, technology is technology, then we had a technical glitch. Then we really appreciate for your patience. Then I'll start again from the slide where I was. I was talking about the vision and the focus area of the association. Then I was saying the vision for the association is to be a leading association in driving, promoting and guiding sustainable implementation of employee ownership enterprises in the Republic of South Africa and beyond. And then as the association, we want to focus on these following areas: to be the voice on employee ownership issues, provide advisory where necessary on companies willing to venture or transit to employee ownership, advisory services to members and non-members of the association on employee ownership issues, advisory on employee ownership, and provide guidance to government on policy choices or selection or formulation, facilitate distribution of wealth to broad-based beneficiaries. That would be mostly your employees that would be benefiting in terms of the trust that will be established. Set up research hub, conduct benchmarks, best practices, lesson learned on employee ownership in partnership with universities, colleges, and research institutions. That's the other plan that we are having as the association. Access to employee ownership information through seminars, workshops, meetings, conferences, webinars, and dialogues. Then we can go to another slide. Then in terms of the South African legislative framework, we know that most of the time when you establish, maybe provide equity, or when you establish employee ownership, most of the time you need to put a legal entity. Mostly the legal entity that is normally utilized, it's your trust. And then the trust in terms of South African perspective is registered in terms of Trust Property Control Act number 57 of 1988 as amended. Then we also have, you can also establish it using the Companies Act of 2008, Act number 71 of 2008, which encourages involvement in employee ownership scheme. I think a lot of attendees, you might know about the employee share ownership scheme, which is one of the program. And in terms of the other support, in terms of legislation, there is also Section 8B and Section 8C of the income tax that is normally utilized, especially with regard to issues of tax exemption that is provided, but it needs to be guided in terms of the scheme, how the scheme is supposed to be established in order to qualify for that incentives. Jayton? Then again, when we look at it, there is political buy-in in South Africa. Then I remember in terms of the quotations that we have documented as the association, somewhere around January 2018, the current sitting president, President Matamela Cyril Ramaphosa, attended a session somewhere where he indicated to say that we need to give the quotation, open quote, give black workers shares, and close quote. Then if that statement is indicated like that, then the question that arises becomes to say, how do you normally give black workers shares? Then that need to be answered, and it need to be answered with regard to policy formulation. Secondly, ANC manifesto of 2019, it indicated, open quote, it will introduce broad-based of workers through an employee ownership scheme and similar arrangement to support, supplement workers' income and build greater partnership between workers and owners to build these businesses, close quote. Then again, the other quotation from ANC coming from the manifesto, it indicated to say social partners, open bracket, government, labor, and business will put together the minimum threshold and conditionalities to govern the establishment of worker ownership funds, paving the way to empower millions of workers across the country. Then again, when I looked on the DA or Democratic Alliance manifesto of 2019, open quote, it says, firstly, award significant weight to employee share ownership scheme so that employees as a group become substantial stakeholders in the business. This will grow black equity while the company will benefit from the increase in terms of productivity that ownership confers, close bracket. These are the quotations coming from the two political parties, but if you go to other political parties like the EFF, they also indicate something having interest in with regard to the issues of giving shares to employees. Another slide. Then with regard to government buy-in, October 2019, President Cyril Ramaphosa upped the game when he put worker ownership of companies on the table at the Congress of the South Africa Clothing and Textile Workers Union, SACTU, and then that's where he indicated to say that they need to also start looking on a way on how best can they make workers to participate as shareholders or part owners of the company. Last year, 2021, the Minister of Department of Trade and Industry and Competition held a media briefing on worker ownership. I attended that media briefing, it was online. And then on the 1st of May, 2021, it was an official launch because we know that the 1st of May is a Workers' Day. Then the minister launched a worker ownership as a government policy direction, encouraging companies to allow employees to acquire equity business and also have board seats at the board of directors level of the specific company. Another slide. Then as a person who worked in the space of employee ownership, having experience around employee ownership in South Africa, I've documented some of the challenges. I think the participant will agree with me on my view on certain challenges that I've noted here. The employee ownership model and objectives or principles are not well understood either by shareholders or management or employees or government, or sometimes you find that universities are not yet into that space that much because you don't really get courses offered around the issues of employee ownership, as well as when you look in terms of research, we have very few research that are South African based on employee ownership. Sometimes there is lack of political willingness to implement the policies, as much as we reflected that there is some political buy-in as well as government buy-in, but at the end of the day, the willingness to implement or having a drive to implement it, I think is lacking there and there. Failure to save closing companies. I think we know last year, a lot of companies closed down since maybe the 2020, when the COVID started. We have Greyhound, we have Playtex, some airlines are experiencing problems. Then we might cite some of the problems to say some companies, when they are closing, you can use employee ownership to save them. No policy to attract or increase uptake of employee ownership. I just indicated with regard to the tax incentives, but you'll find that a lot of companies are not aware about that tax incentives to say if you do employee ownership, you might qualify to get some tax incentives. No proper funding model, then most of the time, then employee ownership is funded through loans, which becomes a burden for the trusts that are structured to repay back the loan. Workers or employees will need to wait for more than 10 years before they can see the real benefits or economic tangible benefits. Lack of dedicated funding to finance employee ownership programs in South Africa. We don't have that, but where I used to work, there was a fund that was set aside, then which used to be called Development Fund. Then it was a concessionary fund. Then most of the trusts that have been funded previously, they've been funded under that fund. Triple BE compliance versus economic development. Most of the time, some companies, they do this for just to comply so that they can get the BE score points, but they overlook on the issue of economic development. Lack of proper structuring of trusts. Some, they just structure the trust and say, we've appointed the board of trustees, but you go and assess as whether those trusts are functional. You find that most of them are dysfunctional. No training, education, either formal or informal, aimed at employee programs, employee ownership programs. Most of the time, you don't get training provided either to the board of trustees or the beneficiaries, including shareholders or management of the companies. Models utilized to finance employee ownership participation, not favorable to promote sustainable implementation of employee ownership in South Africa. Beneficiaries wait for too long to realize tangible benefits. With the circumstances of the high number of inequality and the socioeconomic challenges that South Africa is facing, workers or employees don't have patience to wait for that long, then which challenges us to say that we need to find another way of providing finance to employee ownership. Repayment of loans takes too long, then it goes back to the financial structuring of the transaction. No benchmarks, best practices, lesson learned conducted for EO in the country, then you will get little or you might get zero. I don't think South Africa is really doing benchmarks of best practices or lesson learned on employee ownership as compared to your United Kingdom or United States of America, or even some countries of Europe. They do a lot of benchmarks and best practices. No investment on research by relevant institutions or professional bodies. We don't have research focusing specifically on employee ownership in South Africa. No information dissemination to beneficiaries and other relevant stakeholders. Then this is another gap that is available in South Africa, which I think we really feel that the association will be able to fill some of these gaps. Then with regard to the association's plans and the partners, we just want to highlight this critical part. As the association, our plans are aimed at trying to intervene and address some of the EO challenges as alluded to the previous slide. Then on that, South Africa, the association is ready and willing to partner, work with other association centers across the world, and then we'll indicate that. We want to focus on robust EO or employee ownership advocacy and awareness across the country through webinars, seminars, and conferences. I think this is the start of the day. This is our first webinar that we are hosting in partnership with Wits Business School. Facilitate policy dialogue, because we really believe that employee ownership is an economic policy. Then we really feel that we need to facilitate policy dialogues that shall lead to the development of independent employee ownership policy, not only linked to BBBE. We know that employee ownership is linked to the BBBE currently, because if you talk about the 5 elements of BBBE, one of it is ownership, whereby now employee ownership is defined within that ownership side. We want to have a sector-based driven employee ownership. And I'm just giving an example here. Like in the franchising sector, you can drive a sector-based and say franchising through employee ownership. We have a full model developed around that as franchising through employee ownership. Facilitate and encourage dialogues on policy perspective in the following sectors. In the energy sector, there is a huge space to play whereby employees can participate as equity shareholders, franchising, agriculture, textile. I also mentioned state-owned entities. We know that in South Africa, we have a lot of state-owned entities that are not working properly. Then we can do the restructuring or privatization of state-owned entities using employee ownership, and that would be very beneficial. I can give you an example of Dinel. You know that Dinel has been sitting on a problem for almost 2 to 3 years now. Then I don't know why government is not exploring a way to say, why don't you give part equity to employees as part of their participation to save that entity. Then tourism, mining, manufacturing, ICT, financial or community services. All these different types of sectors, employee ownership fits very well. Enter into formal partnership with universities, both locally and internationally, and partnership with associations already. Southern Africa Employee Ownership is working very closely with the National Center for Employee Ownership in America, which is already 41 years old, implementing employee ownership in the United States. Employee Ownership Association of United Kingdom, it's just celebrating, I think, 42 years of existence. We have relationship with them. Employee Ownership Association of Australia and International Association for Financial Participation in Europe. We do have relationship with those type of association internationally as part of our knowledge accumulation as the association. Potential partnership with Ruptas University. We have some discussion with Ruptas University, which already run a program called Employee Ownership and Profit Sharing Institute with defined employee programs. Some programs are online, some it's fellowships, and then Wits Business School as well. Locally, we are trying to work with Wits Business School around the issue of employee ownership, and we introduce Ruptas University to Wits so that maybe we can see how best we can craft a proper relationship whereby employee ownership and profit sharing can be taught as a program. Facilitate setting up of a fund focusing specifically to finance employee ownership across economic sectors in the country. We really feel that that's very, very critical because, as I indicated previously, one of the failures of employee ownership in South Africa is because there is no a dedicated fund that has been created to finance employee ownership in the country. Partnership with funders, we are looking to say engage maybe with commercial banks, development finance institution, Banking Association of South Africa, so that we can debate around to say how best can we bring in some funding to build into the fund that we're talking about, like we can use impact investment or environment, social and governance, ESG, maybe to set up a fund or maybe tap into the socioeconomic in terms of the BEE, whereby companies are requested to put aside certain amount aside to facilitate socioeconomic development. Then we really think that if we put our heads together, we will be able to tap into different funds to create a fund that will be dedicated to finance employee ownership. Partnership or working closely with unions, civil society, companies, industry bodies, BEE sector codes. That's our plan. We will still need to go out and engage with those institutions so that we can try to champion something together. Then I think if we bring in together our heads, we'll be able to come out with something. One of the other plans that we're trying to bring in, it's on the educational side, but we want to bring in a form of an employee ownership television program that shall feature or cover content like employee ownership drama series, employee ownership talk shows, employee ownership awards, and many other things that we can explore together as a team. I think the association doors will be open for more ideas. Then potential benefits to associate with the association. It's building membership base into a well-defined constituencies across the country, be able to speak with one voice on EO matters, access to conferences, webinars, seminars, either physically or visually. As I indicated that already we enjoy relationship with international association. We really believe that literature is available in abundance, but which is international literature, which can also assist us to develop our own South African perspective literature. Member-to-member peer exchange of information, documenting best practices, lesson learned, benchmarks, mobilize EO funding and make access to finance or incentive easy to finance employee participation, updated EO database. We need to have an updated EO database and additional income. This will apply more to beneficiaries of the employee ownership, like employees who will be working on those specific companies. Receive support post-funding exit. Sometimes you find that the funder will fund the project after you have paid the loan, then there is no support post-funding. EO policy, I think we're taking the issue of EO policy very, very serious, that we might have a webinar that will be focusing on a dialogue that will talk about as whether do we really need employee ownership policy as an independent policy. Facilitate legal assistance on matters related to EO challenges. That will be optional because companies or trusts that will be, or legal entities that will be formed, they may go out and seek legal assistance there and there. Maybe the association may come in as a pro bono. Monitoring and evaluation, which will also assist us on some of the things. In conclusion, we really believe that South Africa has a huge potential to implement successful employee ownership in Africa. The reason is that there are legislative framework to support and facilitate proper transitioning to employee ownership through equity acquisition, employee buyout, succession planning, startups, restructuring of companies facing challenges in various economic sectors. The only thing required in South Africa is to properly engage deeply in defining clear EO policy framework, advocacy and awareness, training, education to change people's mindset and culture. This shall diffuse the notion of forced political to participate in transformation or include blacks in their companies. EO doesn't require people who will implement the program emotionally and always think about addressing political history and just to comply with BBBE. It is an economic policy with defined economic outcomes that shall be beneficial to the country and the target beneficiaries. Employee ownership must be implemented to grow the economy, create decent employment opportunities, eradicate poverty, contribute to income inequalities, contribute to UN sustainable goals, and improve the socioeconomic livelihoods of the target beneficiaries participating in the scheme. Then thank you. Our contact details are on the slide. Then you can contact us through emails. We have the email for the association, info@saeoa.org, Tendani n@saeoa.org, or Cindy t@saeoa.org. As well, we have also provided our mobile numbers to engage with us. Thank you for for allowing us to make this presentation to you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Tendani, for the overview of the association. Moving along, I just wanted to mention, to buttress the point that says our government is actually ready for this employee ownership. If Minister Patel in 2021, hosted a workshop or a seminar where he said more than 150,000 South African employees are part owners of the companies that they work for through shareholding in those firms. That means indeed this topic is relevant and the South African soil is ripe, is ready for us to sow the seed and begin to work with it and let the seed germinate. Without any waste of time, next on our agenda is Dr. Jenica Govinda, who will take us through the uptake of employee ownership in South Africa. Jenica, over to you.
Thank you, Cindy. Appreciate that introduction. And thank you, Tendani, for setting the scene. You have certainly presented some of the challenges that employee ownership experiences in South Africa. And Cindy, in her last sentence or two, indicated that South Africa is indeed ripe and ready for employee ownership to become an initiative that we can all embrace and realize. Interestingly enough, both of you have made reference to, the minister's statement last year in April. And I think, Tendani, you did indicate that you were present at one of these sessions. And I think it was an online session where the minister indicated that South Africa has indeed, there are more than 150,000 South African workers who are now owners of companies they work for. And more worker ownership provisions are being in place or are being put in place in South Africa to allow for more employee ownership. And as encouraging as that may sound, I'm a bit skeptical, and I just find that we do find a lot of lag when it comes to these concerns. There are many companies in South Africa that are willing, that are preparing particularly to expand and to look at employer ownership. The minister estimates that about 100 billion of the value has been transferred to employees in South Africa, and that he was making reference to in 2021. There are a number of companies in South Africa that have implemented and or have agreed to implement employee or worker ownership. And some of those include companies like Coca-Cola Beverages South Africa, PepsiCo South Africa, AB InBev South Africa, as well as Astron Energy Telecoms giant Vodacom, Petrochemicals, Sasol, and Kumba Iron Ore. As commendable as this can be, our concern is that this uptake is slow. In order for us to realize economic breakthrough and economic gain, especially in a time that we find that our economy is struggling, and I think it was once mentioned that it's actually an anemic economy, definitely lacking in the robustness that we would desire or that we would like for the economy to be in. And here we are sitting in a position where we can, and as Tendani explained in his slides, that there is an opportunity and a position for us to tap into the potential of employee ownership, which has a twofold way of creating a better economy. First, obviously, it enables the organization to better manage possible shortfalls in its finances, while we have the employee who's literally demanding to be part of the organization that they belong to. And these, it's a symbiotic relationship that we seem to really ignore. And as much as the minister speaks about this and raises these concerns, I just find that it's unconvincing. And maybe it is up to you, the delegates as well, and individuals like Tendani, like the association that he's just so described, that we start to become the voice of individuals that would really like to become part of these initiatives. I just find in South Africa, we have a tendency to identify issues, but we don't seem to want to act on them. The IDC, for example, has many structures in place. They believe that they've got currently 25 companies on their portfolio with employee share ownership schemes, which they believe covers between or among 4,600 people. The IDC chairperson actually indicated that the corporation has invested more than 1.6 billion in such projects over the last year. Much of those realizations, is very hard to identify. To look at the uptake of employee ownership in South Africa, I would say that it is very slow. I think each one of us as individuals in our organizations or individuals in our own capacity should actually take up this initiative and to advocate for employee ownership. The benefits of these outweigh the challenges or the worrying that comes with it. We have a tendency to believe that employee ownership is all about socialism or taking over the world, and that's not what it is. It is actually about empowering individuals that desperately need to be empowered, individuals that have vested in organizations and yet have not been given the opportunity to add value to their organizations. So why consider issues like retrenchment, downsizing, and opting for operation requirements as excuses not to invite these individuals into the organization and to make them equal contributors to the organization? As I said, the merits of such contribution outweigh the fear that one associates with employer ownership. It is therefore encouraged that we look to employer ownership and obviously look to what the minister is saying, what government is saying, And by example, what these organizations who have clearly decided to engage in employer ownership or to adopt employer ownership, to look at what they are doing. There definitely is merits to what's being done. And why can't we borrow from this and add this to our existing organizations, and many of which are certainly failing? Failing because obviously there are other issues that do surround failure. However, there is opportunity to invite individuals that have a vested interest in the organization to help organizations thrive. I think we need to adopt a sense of openness in South Africa. And apart from what Sindiswa mentioned earlier, that we are ripe to invest, to sow. And although the challenges described by Tendani are overwhelming, I think we can make these changes incrementally. The one thing is documenting the low take up of employer ownership programs in South Africa. The other thing is also not doing anything about it. So the challenge, I think, remains with all of us to consider this initiative and look at how this initiative can be beneficial to the organization and the employee, as both are equal partners in the well-being of these organizations. I think we need to be open-minded about uptake of employer ownership, and we need to make this happen. So me presenting to you this morning, or this afternoon rather, on the uptake is inadequate. It's just telling us that we are lagging. It also tells us that that there are initiatives in place, but they are inadequate. So I can go on and I can labor this point and repeatedly mention the low uptake, and also ask for our delegates to become, individuals that can start making this a reality. And I will repeat this in a loop if need be. The only concern is that repeating it on a loop might not really cause any action. And this is where we need to think seriously about this. I certainly believe that the next speaker, Mr. Cedric De Beer, will enlighten us further about some of these challenges, the way forward, and how we can become contributors to enabling employee ownership in South Africa, and also to open up the way organizations see themselves. Rather than opting for retrenchment, there is an opportunity that is present. Why not grab this opportunity and empower all South Africans in the process? So, Sindiswa, I do thank you for this opportunity, and Tendani, and I know that Cedric is going to have amazing things to say on this topic. And thank you to the delegates for allowing us to share with you, and a climate that many of us take for granted or totally are unaware of it. This is our opportunity to make South Africa better, and I think we need to grab it with both hands. Thank you, Sindiswa. Thank you, Tendani. I hand it over to our facilitator, Sindiswa. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Govind. And indeed, Wits Business School has positioned itself together with the association to actually lead in this discussion in the country, largely because we believe that institution of higher learning, it's where ideas are trashed, are discussed, and are shaped. For it to go out into the industry, it has to be discussed at this level. Hence, we are now going to introduce our guest speaker, which is Mr. Cedric De Beer. Over to you.
Thank you, Cindy, and thank you, Dr. Gobi, for the presentation that you made. I think my role is very short. I'm requested to introduce our guest speaker of the day. And the name of our guest speaker is Cedric De Beer. Cedric has a lot of experience. I think we've shared the experience of Cedric De Beer on the invite that we've sent out, or that was sent out by Wits Business School. He has an experience spanning from 1974, and he has started different organizations. Like some of you might know, he worked for Soros Economic Development Fund. he co-founded Nurture, which is doing a lot of work around issues of providing houses across the country. Then he worked at Joburg City Council. Then he worked for Center for Health Policy. Then he worked for Health Services Unit, Environmental and Development Agency. Then he has been practicing a lot around the issues of social justice. He's an advocate around issues of social justice. I think I met Cedric De Beer when he was working on a program doing research around shared ownership on behalf of one big global non-profit company or non-profit organization, which is based in United Kingdom. Then because they gave him the task to investigate about the issues of shared ownership, which also talk around the issues of inclusivity. And I think today you will share a lot around this type of issues, which will also be an issue to say, how best do we bring in social inclusion using employee ownership or shared ownership as one of the models, which will tie into the theme of the day that says employee ownership is the key to inclusive economy. Thanks for that, Cindy. Then I will give our key speaker or our guest speaker the platform to take us through his experience on shared business ownership. Thank you. Over to you, Cedric.
Thanks, Tendani, and thanks for that introduction. I find myself pleased but a little bit surprised to find myself here. Tendani and I have talked on and off for a good couple of years now. And so I was really pleased to hear that the association has taken this step forward, is developing relationships with universities, and I really hope it grows and gathers momentum. Tendani did ask me to locate this talk in the context of yesterday being Freedom Day. And so this is a little bit about the importance of shared ownership within the political economy of South Africa. I'm not going to get into the technicalities of shared ownership because I'm sure that the other people on the panel are much better prepared to do that. But it's more about really trying to emphasize what Dr. Govind was saying and the other speakers. This is a matter of really serious urgency, one might even say survival, in my view, in the South African economy. And I'm going to get to this in a moment. So when I used to do a lot of public speaking, I haven't done it for a while, I was always told you should signpost your talk. So here are my signs to give you some idea of what I'm going to cover as we go through this. And so it's important to say that we want to put this in the context of the extent of poverty and inequality in South Africa, because that is the reality in which we work, and that the reality that we're trying to change. I'm going to talk a lot about, quite a lot, about the vagueness of the concept of inclusive growth. And I think it's important because it's what we often get given as, well, if you're going to solve poverty and inequality, we need inclusive growth. And I'm going to delve into both that notion and whether it's really a solution and what it means. And in doing that, I'm going to ask this question, can we really grow our way out of poverty, or do we have to do something else? And finally come to employee ownership in the South African context, and just to try and combat the notion, not that I really need to, because Tendani's done this already, but there's nothing particularly radical about it, and that in fact, the idea of employee ownership can have and should have wide political support, and even support from a wide variety of economic viewpoints, and to touch then on the South African opportunity and why I think it's important. So that's the science, and I'll try and keep us on track there. Thanks. Okay, so this is Kwame Nkrumah, 1957, saying just before Ghana's independence as the first independent country on the African continent, "Seek first the political kingdom, and all else shall be added to you." And obviously the message that he was conveying at the time was that with political power comes the ability to transform people's lives and to add everything else, including economic justice, I guess. And just to say, sorry, we'll get there in a second. 28 years ago, and a day, we stood in those snaking queues to cast our ballots and to achieve what we thought was the political kingdom in South Africa. And indeed we did it, and it was an important moment in South Africa's life, an important moment in the political transition. What we have certainly discovered in the process is that the political kingdom does not automatically take us into a sort of, not even a utopia, but a substantial improvement in shared prosperity. And that actually there is a need for a much more active and considered attempt to share the fruits and wealth of the country and to ensure that everybody benefits. And really what I'm contending in that context is that shared ownership is an important part of that strategy. Sorry. So it just is important to create this context, because we're not talking about something that's nice to do. We're not dealing with a normal situation. We really are dealing with a crisis in South Africa, and it's a crisis of poverty and inequality above all else. You know, when we live in a world in which 350 Rand a month as an emergency payment to families saves lives, if it does save lives, that's really a serious indictment of the state of the economy and the state of people's lives in the country. The 350 Rand can really make the difference between survival and non-survival. The expanded unemployment rate is now up at 45%, more than that, I think. It might even be over 50%. Certainly youth unemployment, which is the real crisis, or the biggest part of the crisis, is at around 60%. Expanded unemployment is just the real unemployment rate. It includes those people who stopped looking for work, not just those people who are looking for work. And if you consider the fact that 7,000 Rand per month as income puts you in the top 10% of earners in the country, then you understand the extent of inequality. Because there are a small number of us, I'm sure I include all of us in this room, who earn that or substantially more than that, and yet that puts us in the top 10% of income earners. And so the extent of inequality is really quite dramatic, and it's something that needs to be addressed, and it needs to be addressed by doing something different. Something different from inclusive growth. I mean, inclusive growth has become my own personal bugbear. It's the term that I like least of all. It's something that almost all politicians and that leaders of business organizations trot out when you ask what are we going to do about all of this thing. They tell us, well, what we need is inclusive growth. And when you ask the question, well, what is inclusive growth? They can tell you a lot about growth. You'll get a whole shopping list of items that tell you about growth, that we need to attract investors, we need to regularize the policy environment, we need to create certainty for people who are going to bring in money, we should be privatizing the SOEs, sorry, we should reduce the amount of bureaucracy that business needs to deal with. We should simplify the labor laws. We should invest in infrastructure. there's just a whole lot of stuff that we really need to do if we want growth. Fine. And I don't think that much of that might be wrong. But when you ask people the next question, well, what's the inclusive part of it? Then you don't get too many answers, okay? Just think for yourself, if you're a supporter of inclusive growth, what is it really? And how do you do it? Because what I find when I ask people this question is that, well, we've got to grow so we can create jobs, that's inclusive. Or we've got to support small business development. Or we must provide financial inclusion so that people are included in the financial sector and can borrow money and start small businesses. And I've done a lot of reading about inclusive growth as a sort of global ideal. And the truth of the matter is, nobody tells us very much. It tends to be my favorite idea about development, tacked onto economic growth. That's inclusive growth, and it's no content. And we've had certainly 10 years of being told about inclusive growth, and all that's happened is we're worse off than we were before. And I know we've had a pandemic, and I know we've had all kinds of other things go wrong. But the truth of the matter is inclusive growth doesn't help very much, and I want to talk about it. In fact, when you listen to it, it sounds like what the outdated concept of trickle down. If things grow, then if there's enough growth, then somewhere else will trickle down, and we will all be okay. But actually, trickle down is really just a joke. And this is Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher having a quiet laugh. Somebody put in a clever caption there. Really? We told them it would trickle down too. But the problem is it's not funny. Because the truth of the matter is that since these two and their political allies unleashed the kind of neoliberal myth on the world, they let the genie out the bottle, the genie that had been carefully cultivated by Milton Friedman and other economists for a period of 20 or 30 years or longer. The notion that government is bad, that business should be free from all constraints, that the only purpose of that business is the business of business, that the job of business is to maximize profits for shareholders, and increasingly that shareholders have been distant investors who really have no interest except making money, often by kind of rapid trades and things like that, is a kind of virus, in my view, that swept the world, infecting not just the whole of the global economy, but also many of the multilateral organizations, was imposed on governments by the World Bank and the IMF, and has resulted in broken economies around the world. Nobody really believes this anymore. Nobody really believes in small government. And if you see that the United States and Europe and other Western countries have spent literally their governments trillions of dollars, not so much on rescuing the economies through the pandemic and the lockdowns, but rescuing companies through the pandemics and the lockdowns. You'll see that the notion that small government is good really has gone out the window. And even the World Bank and the IMF admit these days that those policies were not that good. So things don't trickle down. And in fact, that sound you hear is the loud whooshing of wealth as it gets sucked up from both the middle and working classes in developed countries and from the global south as a whole into the vaults of fewer and fewer investors who are the source of funding. And the loud slamming noise you hear is those vaults slamming shut and preventing really the possibility of social mobility. And inequality gets worse globally, inside wealthy countries and between wealthy and poor countries. So we have to do something different. And really what I'm saying is sharing business ownership is part of it. So nonetheless, I want to bring us back quickly, I'm sorry, to this question of growth and of inclusive growth and growing our way out of poverty. And I'm doing it because if you're looking for an alternative to the current solutions, you have to understand just how unreasonable the current solutions are. So I want to ask this question. Can we grow our way out of poverty? And the answer to rephrase, or rather to steal the term from President Obama was, yes, we can, but. I'm just going to give you a couple of scenarios here. I'm quoting here from a man called David Woodward, who did a long paper in 2015 for the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, so not a dangerous radical by any means at all. And he sought out to ask this question: if we were to grow our way out of poverty, what would we have to do? And his very detailed analysis, which I can make available to people if they're interested, is this: that if we grew and aimed at $5 a day per person globally, this is not South Africa, this is globally, and we grew at 4% a year, and the distribution of the proceeds of growth, which almost all go to the wealthy and maybe a few trickle down, well, we would get to $5 a day per person per year, per person per day, in 200 years. And the global economy would have to grow 170 times. So if you think about that, the truth of the matter is that that's completely impossible. I mean, we would all be burned to cinders by then. And certainly all of us in this conversation would be dead. So he took his analysis a little bit further and asked this question: well, what about if we grew at 4% a year, and the poorest 10% benefited proportionately as the rich do, in terms of the 1%, in terms of their benefits of growth? And he said, now then you'd have a much better scenario. You could eradicate poverty in 100 years, and the global economy would only have to grow 19 times. Again, a prospect that's not possible in a carbon-constrained world. And case 3, which he called pro-poor growth himself, said, well, if you actually tilted the distribution so that the poor benefited more than the rich from economic growth, then at 4% a year in 55 years, with the global economy only growing 6 times, we could eradicate poverty. $5 a day per person was not a very ambitious notion of eradicating poverty, but that's what it is. And so I just want to suggest that the notion that growing our way out of the poverty in South Africa is more unequal, and the growth is more anemic than most other parts of the world, is just not a prospect. Even if we take the pro-poor version, which would be really quite inclusive, it talks about the need for great structural changes, you would still not grow our way into economic justice. And remember, we're talking about the context of the South Africa in which we've achieved political freedom, and now we need to move towards economic justice. I'm avoiding talking about economic freedom, both because it's a term that I don't quite understand, and because it has connotations that I don't particularly want to be associated with. And to kind of emphasize, to say why this seems unrealistic, I think, is because when we talk about solving the world's economic problems and social injustice through growth, we really, in a sense, we're always just talking about the income statement and never about the balance sheet. We're talking about a fairer, maybe, distribution of money to be earned by the global or the South African economy in the future. And we're completely ignoring the historical imbalance, if you like, the global balance sheet. There's enough wealth in the world really to solve the problems of poverty and unemployment and inequality. It's the distribution that's at issue. And I'm not suggesting any kind of just carve up the world's wealth and share it out amongst people. But we need to recognize that when we are dealing with the poverty and inequality, we are dealing with, if you like, 400 years of a process in which the United States of America and Europe literally did carve up the world, literally did enslave tens of millions of people, literally did extract the wealth from India and Africa and take it into their countries and build their wealth. And now what you have is a balance sheet which is so hugely biased in their favor, and through trade agreements and other things that pulled the ladders out from under the feet of people so that the rest of the world can't follow. And this is true in South Africa as well. I know I'm making a political speech, but it was a political context that I was asked to talk about. And the same thing is true. You know, it may be uncomfortable to talk about, but we had 400 years of colonialism. We had people driven off the land. We had the frontier wars of the 19th century. We had the Land Acts of the 20th century, which confined 13% of the population, confined 80% of the population to 13% of the land. We had the forced removals of the 1970s that drove 3 million people from their homes and into poverty-stricken areas. And out of that process, some people got really rich. A few people got really rich. Some people did really well, and the vast majority of the country got impoverished. It's not that people are undeveloped, it's that they've literally been impoverished and had their share of the wealth of the society taken away from them. So I'm just wanting to suggest that in ways that are feasible and possible, that accumulated wealth, which I'm calling the balance sheet, both of South Africa and globally, really we need to find ways to share them and not just to dangle the notion that there's going to be this 4% growth somehow and we're going to trickle some of that down to the poor people and we're going to eradicate social problems that way. So that's the context, in a sense, in which you want to look at it. Now, it is true globally and in South Africa. I mean, it's also true in a slightly different sense of the family, that the eradication of poverty is not just about 350 Rand a month emergency pay or 1,600 Rand a month social security grants, or slight increases that workers who are lucky enough to be employed are able to negotiate with themselves. Those things are important and they do make a difference in people's lives. But poverty actually ends when families have assets, so that you have an asset base and not just income. So in a sense, this notion of let's focus on the balance sheet and not just the income statement is both true of an explanation of global poverty in South African poverty and inequality, but it also has to be part of the solution. And so this is what I find so attractive about the notion of shared employee ownership. That in a way, what one is doing by creating what I hope becomes a major movement towards employee ownership or worker ownership, sharing in the fruits of the economy, is that you are literally sharing the balance sheets of those companies that to some extent represent the accumulated wealth of the country. For those people who have historically and in the past been excluded from the economy and have been quite deliberately subordinated as very poorly paid workers, driven off the land into the mines and the ancillary industries over the past 100 years. And that is something, and this is the point that Tendani and Dr. Govind mentioned earlier, it's something that is doable, firstly, and secondly, as Tendani showed us, it's something that is, at least in word, supported by quite a broad spectrum of the Southern political population. and therefore ought to be something that we can get a move on. Is it a communist plot? Well, let's give you some examples. Mondragon in Spain is the 10th biggest company in the country. It employs 70,000 workers. It has annual revenue of 20 billion euros. And it is now really a series of large companies owned entirely by the people who work in Mondragon. It was set up as a small business building, manufacturing kitchen equipment in the aftermath of the Spanish Civil War in the Basque Country, and has grown to this very significant enterprise. So that's Mondragon. On the other end of the spectrum, in some ways, is I want to talk briefly about KKR private equity. I think it's the largest private equity shop in the world. It's certainly an absolute huge fund located in the United States. Not very progressive reputation, even amongst private equity. It's been seen in the past as being quite a predatory group of investors. But in the last few years, KKR, under the leadership of one of their directors, Pete Stavros, have literally handed over 500 million shares in workers in 8 of their largest industrial companies that they hold. And I'm going to talk a little bit more in a moment about the rationale and why they see themselves doing that. John Miller's partnership in the United States, retailer owns, owns one of the very large retail shops in the United Kingdom, Waitrose. Again, employees call themselves partners, they're share owners, 80,000 of them, and revenue of 12.3 billion pounds a year. So these are really, there's a strand of employee ownership that has always existed in the society, and which we really ought to pick up and give momentum to. Just to note that Harley Davidson, that icon, if you like, of rugged individualism, anyway, Harley Davidson recently, following the lead of KKR, has granted shares and ownership to its 4,500 employees. And so a lot of companies are doing it. And as Tindani mentioned, so I won't dwell on it, all those organizations that he was mentioning in the United States, in Canada, in the United Kingdom, are not, in fact, worker movements to seize control of companies. They are driven by elements of the business community who see employee ownership as, in a sense, the next stage of the development of a global economy that is different from one that we have at the moment. Pete Stavros really is interesting to me. I mean, I was deeply suspicious when I heard about KKR's venture into ownership. I thought maybe they were giving shares in failing companies to workers to somehow offload their equity there, but that's not the case. And Pete Stavros has spent something like $10 million of his own money and has raised a lot of other money to set up a non-profit, private equity non-profit is interesting, but to set up a non-profit organization called Ownership Works to develop a movement, or to further develop a movement in the United States to promote employee ownership, to lobby for changes in the tax laws, to facilitate that. And you know, it's an interesting thing in the United States that there's a couple of $1 trillion worth of baby boomer businesses that are coming to the end of their baby boomer owners' lives or interest in working. And so the option for the creation of a financing structure, as Tindani was talking about, that protects those companies from bottom-feeding private equity and puts them in the hands of their employees is really quite an interesting prospect for transformation in the US economy. And there's quite a lot of interest in doing that. And the fact that you have a leading private equity actor who is clearly not a secret communist, I think is a very interesting and important part of that. So, you know, I'd like to just sell you the notion that this is something that that is important. And again, I'm not going to dwell on this because I think Tindani also mentioned this, but the companies find that shared business ownership has benefits. It has benefits for the workers whose income goes up and whose assets grows over time. And so you get the beginnings of intergenerational wealth that can be passed down from worker to worker children and the next generation. Productivity by and large does go up. Social cohesion goes up. Importantly, these companies are found to be more resilient in times of crisis. So during COVID, I know it's true at Mondragon, they took decisions about cutting employee income, 5 or 10%, but keeping everybody on the payroll, even when Spain was in a very, very tight lockdown, as we know it was for some of this time. And finally, and I mean, you know, I personally think this is very important, that the notion that companies are owned not by some distant investors whose only interest is to wring the maximum amount of benefit out of those companies, to maximize profit for themselves, but to act in the interest of all the employees in the best interest, and secondly, in the interest of the communities in which they live, is really important to me. So, you know, the benefits seem to be really quite incontestable in a way. Which brings us to the South African opportunity, and I have very little more to say in this regard because it feels to me like Tindani covered this in a lot of detail. There has been some experience. I've put mining, land and agriculture and tourism, and both Tindani and Dr. Govind mentioned other industries, retail and industrial, where these things have happened. And it has been with mixed experience. And you know, I'd like us to commit effort to learning from those experiences and improving on them. I think that some of the lessons that need to be learned is that the cost of structuring some of these deals is very high, and the cost of funding them is very high. And the point that Tindani was making is if you've got to wait 10 years to actually earn anything out of your ownership, then ownership becomes a rather unattractive option, and you would rather insist on higher wages. And also, if you say to people, will you own the company, will you own a little bit of the company, but we're going to exclude you from the governance structures and we're not going to let you in to understand what the financial state of the company is, and all the important management decisions are taken without you, then you know, that also is not going to buy workers into the notion that sharing ownership is a beneficial thing for themselves. And I do want to emphasize this need for professional management. I think there's this fear that if one talks about employee ownership, you talk about employees making decisions in the short-term interest rather than in the long-term interest of the company. And that is, of course, a danger. I mean, if you actually hand over the company and the governance and the decision-making lock, stock and barrel, there's a danger that workers will make short-term decisions about dividend payouts and other things. Managers do it, so I don't know why workers wouldn't, which are not necessarily to the benefit of the company. So this is not about talking about discarding professional management in any way at all. And in fact, when I asked this question earlier about is it a communist plot, I'm not going to name the person or the union, but as someone who's engaged in trade union investments, companies very interested in promoting worker ownership, said to me when we were talking about these things, Cedric, you might think I'm a communist, but I'm not stupid. And the companies need to run. There's no point in investing money in for our workers if they then collapse. Those companies need to run. So the last thing I want to say about this is that, you know, sorry, let me see what my next slide says. Yeah, just to talk about the South African opportunity for a moment. And I want to sort of try and lift this up out of the politicization of the issue and the great amount of detail that Tindani and Dr. Govind gave you. That it really, for me, the notion that people get a stake in the wealth of the country, not just by pay, but by ownership, is really an important part of trying to undo what's happened in the past. It's not all that has to happen. There are millions of unemployed people who are not going to put shares in companies, no matter what happens in the short term. One has to talk about basic income grants and wealth taxes and all kinds of other things. But shared ownership is something that it really seems to me is something we can do without controversy if we get the political will and move past the rhetoric and into the implementation. And in the medium term, that requires government, the private sector, the trade unions, and other political parties to do the things that need to be done to give this momentum. You know, to make the policy changes, to create tax incentives, to look at what's best practice, to educate people about that, to provide the kind of support that Tindani is talking about the association is doing, and to create funding mechanisms or to retool the funding mechanisms. I mean, everybody's talking about a government bank. The government has tons of banks. It's got the development bank, it's got the IDC, it's got the land bank, it's got many financing institutions, all of which like to pretend they're in the private sector rather than actually playing a developmental function. So they need to be retooled and more money needs to be put into them to finance the transfer of shares to workers. But I want to kind of make a suggestion to the private sector, I don't know who's on the call, that this really is something you can lead on. You don't need government to do this. You don't have to have policies that like BE policies or all those kind of policies. You can just go ahead and do it yourself. And you can lead the way and show the proof of concept and get the support of the association and others and become part of that movement to show through proof of concept that this can work. And I avoided using the term reparations, but let's just talk about some of it as restitution as well. So the wealth of the country has been built, it has been built on exploitation, and it has been built on impoverishment, and it has been built on land seizure. It's not anybody's fault anymore. None of us were there when it happened, but it's just the reality of the past. And that if we have a vision that is not just a grumbling about how bad things are, or a kind of endless wrangling with our workers at the shop floor about what percentage they're going to earn in wage increases. If we have a vision that we can kickstart something new and big and really make a difference as acts of restitution, then when Tindani talks about creating a fund to begin to look at financing this process, you know, I'd really urge people to think about contributing to that fund or finding ways to make grants shares to the workers that are not tied up in so much debt and such long-term structuring that people are actually impoverished rather than enriched through the process. So that's really what I have to say about this, and I hope it was a contribution to the discussion. If you want to argue with me, you can get hold of me at that email address, and I've given you my phone number. I'm happy to take your calls. The website is a kind of blog of mine, in which you can find everything from poetry to critical articles on impact investing and the kind of subject I've talked about today. Thank you.
Thank you, Cedric. It was indeed an insightful presentation. Some take-off points that, for me, it's things that we have to ponder on as participants, or people would have to ponder on. That when you said the private sector does not necessarily need to wait for government for them to implement this. I mean, there is a framework already, and that can assist private sector to be able to start. I mean, already PepsiCo has started the process, so there is lessons that we can learn from PepsiCo to say, how did you do this? How best can we do it if we are a private sector and want to do that? I would now like to hand over to Dr. Jenica Gorbent. Jenica, who will do the Q&A and also wrap up the session. Over to you, Jenica.
Thank you, Sindiswa. I think you were quite right. I mean, Cedric has provided us with some of the benefits of employee ownership and some of the initiatives that have been successful internationally that we could easily adopt and implement in South Africa. So I think that was quite an eye-opener and makes us think about how we too can get this process going. So this is, we are at the stage now where we would like to take the questions from delegates. As you know, that there is a chat, there's a Q&A session, and you can put in your questions in that section, and I will be able to then read them out to the panel members, and panel members will then be able to answer. I see we have a first question, but he later did indicate, so Gary did indicate that how can I turn, where can I, or who can I speak to that can assist with a good policy for retail? And then he says that his question was answered. So I trust that was answered in Tendani's session. So are there any other questions? Please, if there are other questions, please add them into the Q&A section and we can address them. So I think whilst we are waiting for delegates to type in their questions, maybe we could ask Tendani and maybe Cedric as well as to where can one get a good policy, a good starting document that could assist an organization that is considering employer ownership initiative. Tendani, any suggestions?
If I may answer, Dr. Gorbent, thanks very much for that question or statement for clarification. I think anyone who will need their assistance, as we said, we will be using more best practices. There is a lot of documentations that are available that provide guidance in one way or the other in terms of transiting from being a private-owned company to employee ownership. There are video clips that can summarize the processes. And then as well, in the country, we also have
I think we've just lost you for a second or two there, Tendani.
Continue.
Sorry, Dr. Gorbent. Thank you. Yeah, I was saying there is material that is available, which can be shared in one way or the other, which can come in a form of a document that provides guidance, or it can come up with in a form of videos, but some of them, they might be not local information, but the process is almost similar. Either you are using somebody's legislation coming maybe from UK or wherever, but the issue of transiting from private ownership to employee ownership, it's almost similar. Then secondly, in the country, you do have practitioners that are available that are practicing more, providing advisory with regard to BEE, then which some, I think, they do provide some services on how best can you transit from maybe private ownership to employee ownership, even if, because if you look at South Africa currently, we are not a firm believer of 100% employee ownership. Most of the time, we do employee ownership in bits and pieces, whereby majority, I don't think you'll even get a majority shareholding that exceeds 20%. Then most of the time is 10%, 15% up to 20% ownership by employee ownership. Then if they contact us as the association, will be able to provide that guidance on how they can do it. And then we can refer, because as an association, we don't have capacity to handhold you to move through each and every step that you need to follow. Thank you.
Thank you, Tendani. Cedric, would you like to add on any other policies or suggestions on how one can start this process?
No, I don't think that I have that kind of nitty-gritty expertise. Yeah, I mean, I think that probably you and Tendani have much more of that, and Cindy. I mean, I think that what's interesting is to have a look at the global picture. At there are a lot now of resource organizations set up to support the process, and I mean, Tendani is in touch with I think with almost all of those now, from Canada, the United States, from the United Kingdom, and I think it's about drawing on those best practices, and you can create those references to them. Right?
Yeah, there is a lot of them.
Yeah.
And by the way, maybe to add, most of the associations said they are willing to provide materials that can be utilized to guide wherever when necessary. Dr. Govind?
Sorry, Tendani, I think I lost you there for a second. But what I can confirm at this point is that we do not have any further questions. I do apologize. There appears to be a technical glitch on my side. As I indicated earlier, there aren't any questions on the Q&A section at this point in time. So maybe just ask delegates that if they do have a question for either myself or Tendani or Cedric or Sindiswa at this point, that you please type that in and we can address that. I will give you a few minutes. I think maybe let's just take this opportunity whilst you type in your questions at this point, is maybe just ask if Cedric or Tendani would like to add something in closing as we approach the closing of our session this afternoon. Cedric, you being our special guest at the session today, I would like for you to say something as your closing, please. Thank you.
Thanks, Jenica. I just finished talking. I all talked out. But I would like to make the point that, it seems to me that here is something practical, possible, not threatening to the social order in the form of, expropriation without compensation or land occupations or seizures of factories and all the things that people worry about. And I mean, I did want to say, I think I meant to say this at the beginning, that there's a danger in South Africa. I mean, the people on the call, it's not fair to say this because people on the call are obviously interested. There's a danger in South Africa that we get so overwhelmed by bad news, by kind of anxiety around governance and corruption and state capture and floods and social disorder and movements that are kind of terrorizing people, that we just throw up our hands and say, we give up. There's nothing to do. I'm just going to look after myself. And I really think it's important to kind of find things that you can do that take you beyond that sense of pessimism. And to the extent that you can contribute to the academy on this, to the academic work on this, to the research on this, to popularizing it, to writing about it if you're a journalist, to practicing it if you're an employer. You know, I think let's kind of move beyond the fog and into a little bit of sunlight to make things happen.
Thank you, Cedric. Tendani, on your side?
Thank you. On my side, I don't have any other issues except maybe to encourage participants to spread the word, because one of the issues that we are trying to do as the association is to make more awareness that employee ownership, it's one way of trying to develop an economic policy that will cover and try to reduce maybe unemployment, because it has an element of saving jobs, saving companies, and then maybe to encourage the participants to say, let's start collaborating, engaging. If the unions are in attendance, we will really want to engage with the unions around the whole issue to say, how do we go about developing policies that will be beneficial to both shareholders, employees, the union as an entity, the economy, government, all the participants in one way or the other. Then we are encouraging collaboration, and then we will be available to share a lot of best practices based on our networks that we have. Then I think, to me, as the association will be coming more with thought-provoking topics in the near future, whereby we'll be encourage policy dialogues, talk shows around employee ownership, because we really feel that as a country, we can implement the right employee ownership that will be beneficial to all participants. Then now I will encourage all participants to say that from today, it's a start. Then we are looking forward to engage more and come up with a product that will be beneficial to the country, so that we can use employee ownership as a catalyst as a catalyst to the recovery plan of South Africa, so that at the end of the day, we reduce the 45% unemployment rate as indicated by Cedric on an expanded definition, to come down to the lower level. I mean, we can't really afford to have a country whereby you have more than close to 10 million people unemployed. And we're saying employee ownership is one of the platforms that can be utilized as a catalyst to try to address those issues that we alluded on all presentations that we made today. Then on that note, I think I will say I'm looking more to get more engagement when we go out there as the association. Thank you.
Thank you, Tendani. I think that's a great note to end off in, where we are actually creating awareness, creating initiative, and we are looking forward to more engagement, I think, with the private and public sector regarding employee ownership. And I do not see any other questions on the chat section. And I'd like to just, from my behalf, thank the delegates for joining us today, as I return you to Sindiswa. Thank you, Cindy.
Thank you, Dr. Golden, and thank you to all the participants for spending time engaging with us. Thank you to Cedric. We indeed enjoyed the talk, the presentation, and it actually it was an eye-opener to some of us about some of the issues that we might not have thought of, because you know, when you are passionate about something, you always think everyone is interested in it. But when you find out certain touching points that are sensitive, because we are not going to run away from the fact that South Africa at the moment we're in a sensitive stage. Therefore, we have to navigate this discussion knowing very well that we're not replacing BEE, we're not replacing any other policy, but we are saying within BEE there is an element that we can use, which is employee ownership. And I mean, if other companies like Coca-Cola, InBev, all the companies that we mentioned have already started doing so, that means there is a way forward. It's just a matter of getting the willingness, both from companies and also the employees, to be educated, impacted and educated about what is this employee ownership.
So it appears that we are having some technical issues. And in light of that, I would like to thank participants Tendani, Sindiswa, and Cedric for the session today. Thank you to the delegates who've made time out to listen to us. Thank you to the WBS team. Today's Zoom session would have not been possible. This webinar would have not been possible without our marketing team, Rutendo and Temeka, and our ICT team, Jason, putting this together. We look forward to further dialogue on this topic of employer ownership. And I would like for you to watch this space as we introduce you to other speakers that will give us better understanding and outlook on employer ownership. Thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate your time, and we look forward to our next dialogue. Thank you.